literary criticism and theory in the 20th century. Advertisements. 20th century literary criticism and theory has comprised a broad range of tendencies and movements. A humanistic tradition descending from 19th century writers much as Matthew Arnold and continued into the 20th century through figures such as Irving Babbitt and F.R. Lewis, surviving in our own day in scholars such as Frank Kermode and John Carey. A new romantic tendencies expressed in the work of D.H. Lawrence G. Wilson Knight and others. The new criticism arising initially in the 1920s and subsequently formalized and popularized in the 1940s. The tradition of Marxist criticism traceable to the writings of Marx and Engels themselves. Psychoanalytic criticism, whose foundations were laid by Freud and Jung. Russian formalism, arising in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Structuralism, which emerged fully in the 1950s, building on the foundations establishment in the early 20th century by Chaucer and Levi-Strauss, and the various forms of criticism which are sometimes subsumed under the label of post-structuralism, Lacanism, psychoanalytic theory which rewrote Freudian concepts. This construction, which emerged in 1960s, as did feminism, readers' response theory, whose roots were back to Husserl and Heidegger, and the new historicism, which arose in the 1980s. At the end of the 19th century, criticism in Europe and America had been predominantly biographical, historical, psychological, impressionistic, and empirical. With the establishment of English as a separate discipline in England, many influential critics such as George Saintsbury, A.C. Bradley, and Arthur Quiller Couch assumed academic posts in America. Influential theories of realism and naturalism had been propounded by William Dean Howells, Hamlin Garland, and Frank Norris. An important concern of American critics such as John Massey, Randolph Bowney, and Van Wyck Brooks was to establish a sense of national identity through tracing a specifically American literary tradition In France, the most preventive critical mode was the explication de text based on close readings, which drew upon biographical sources and historical context in the humanist tradition of Matthew Arnold. Much of this fin de seal criticism saw in literature a refuge from or a remedy for the ills of modern civilization in both American and Europe. The defenders and proponents of literature sought to preserve the humanities in the educational curriculum against the onslaughts of reformists such as Harvard University President Charles Eliot and John Drew, who urged that the college education system should be brought into line with prevailing bourgeois scientific and economic interest. The West political and economic. Now, developments discussed above provided the broad context in which the literature and criticism of the 20th century across the humanities tradition of the late 19th century reacting against the commercialism and philistinism of bourgeois society was continued and intensified in the polemic of the new humanists led by Harvard Professor Irving Babbitt and including figures such as Paul Elmer, Moore Norman, Foster and Stuart Sherman. The new humanists were conservative in their cultural and political outlook, reacting against what they saw as a relativistic disorder or styles and approaches characterizing early 20th century America. They rejected the predominant tendencies stemming from the liberal bourgeois tradition, a narrow focus on the present at the expense of the past and of tradition, understand freedom in political, moral, and aesthetic domains, a trait of pluralism, a mechanical exhalation of facts, and an ununiformed worship of science. So, this is all about the topic. Also, reacting against the individualism and rationalism of the bourgeois world were the neo-romantic critics in England, including D. H. Lawrence, G. Wilson Knight, John Milton, Murray, Herbert Reed, and C. S. Lewis. Lawrence, 1885-1930, was an avid irrationalistic who saw the modern industrial world as sexually repressive and as having stunned human potential. In his own highly idiosyncratic was Lawrence anticipates the stress on the unconscious, the body, and irrational motives in various areas of contemporary criticism. In general, these critics attempted to Renaissance, a romantic belief, a pantheism, and the organic unity of the world. Murray and an organist is aesthetic, which saw poetry as an organic totality, transcending reason and the possibility of the paraphrases in prose. So, guys, these are all criticism of the literature and World War, etc. I again explain in my another video. Thank you.